Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the series of podcasts on the Asian financial crisis. Where we last left off, Southeast Asian economies were taking off, and growth came in leaps and bounds. People were even calling some countries economic miracles and Asian tigers. From developmental backwaters to industrialized and highly modernized economies in a few decades, Southeast Asia seemed primed for success. How did it all come crashing down in 1997? The AFC, an unprecedented event in independent Southeast Asia, erupted in June 1997. It sent shockwaves across the region. It devastated economies, it caused social unrest, and even toppled governments. How did it all come crashing down in 1997? Well, let's journey on to find out. You're listening to Radio Anesh, and this podcast has been kindly sponsored by KFC because they sound like AFC. Okay, hi guys. True to my nature, what a dramatic start, and how fitting it is for dramatics for this final topic of our syllabus, the Asian financial crisis. It's a pretty exciting period of time of study, and hopefully when we go through it, you will see how dynamic this short space of about 2 to 3 years was. It was a seminal event in Southeast Asia. It's unprecedented. We've never seen a crisis like this on any level in the independent period. Such devastation, such calamity that was going on in the region in the area of economics, in social and in political as well. So let's try to uncover what went on with the Asian financial crisis, and we'll conclude our syllabus with this. So I hope you enjoy this last topic that we have. Now, for the Asian financial crisis, primarily the whole topic, the body of content and our focus, our objectives, they are broken down into 3 distinct portions. The first portion, which is what this podcast will start off with today, is to look at the causes of the AFC. So here we are looking at the origins of what caused the crisis, and we have to look as far back as several decades before 1997 itself. And then we have to look at the events in 1997 itself as well, in order to get a holistic picture of what caused the initial outbreak in July 1997. So the first big kind of subtopic in this last topic that we have is on the causes of the AFC. So we're looking at the different causes, we're trying to weigh between the causes in terms of relative importance, and we're trying to figure out what was the main cause of the Asian financial crisis. The second thing that we will talk about in this topic is to do with the responses to the Asian financial crisis. So this is kind of when the crisis already breaks out in July 97. How do governments and non-state actors respond to the crisis? Sometimes their response are perfectly aligned to the core of the problem, and therefore the remedy is good and the solutions are good and recovery is fast. But sometimes the responses, they are either poorly thought out, they are inadequate, they are not committed to, there's still a lot of corruption and the lack of political will going on, and therefore it doesn't really address the core nature of the problem, it sidesteps it, and therefore the crisis in those other countries are prolonged longer than others. One of the big things that you will see about the AFC is that, and once again to reinforce the diversity of Southeast Asia, is that different countries experience the crisis differently. Some are more experience it more severely than others. Some experience it longer than others, and we are trying to see the reasons why this was so. So not just because of the causes of the AFC, but sometimes in the responses, it can either prolong the crisis or it can find quick solutions to the crisis. So second big topic that we're thinking that we're going to look at is about the responses to the crisis. We're looking at how the economic agents responded to the crisis, and to what effectiveness did they respond. The third thing that we are looking at is the consequences of the AFC. So the consequences of the AFC, you can say it's quite closely connected to the responses bit, but the consequences of the AFC, we are looking at how the extent of damage. We are looking at not just damage in the economic sphere, but we are looking at damage in the economic, political, and social sphere, because as I mentioned before, something that happens in the economic sphere could have consequences in other spheres as well, like the political and the social. In turn, the consequences in the political and social sphere would then perhaps exacerbate the economic damage that caused the entire chain of events in the first place. So I think that's something to consider as well, the extent of damage, the extent of the consequences. The extent of the consequences can also be seen in terms of the extent of damage across the region. So what started out in Thailand in July 1997, pretty soon it spread to the entire region of Southeast Asia. And for that, we can also try to assess why was there an escalation, why was there an enlargement of the initial crisis in Thailand? How come there was this contagion effect in the region? So these are the kind of things that we are trying to uncover and to assess as well. Just to give you'll get the notes for this, and the timeline is in the notes itself, so don't worry if you can't see the words, they're a bit small. But just to give you a sensing of what the AFC looks like in 1997 itself, from mid-1997 itself, we can start in May 1997. By this point in time, the Thai currency, the baht, is already under attack and is under quite intense attack. Thailand is drawing from its reserves to try to defend the baht, to try to keep the parity of it. But you can see as time progresses, this solution is unsustainable and it generates a lot of problems. It creates an unsustainable situation. In July 92, on July 2nd, 97, Thailand devalues the baht by 20%, and the peg against the USD is abandoned. So, and not only that, they also request assistance from the IMF. I think this really starts the chain of events, because the national crisis at this point in time is full-blown, and everyone can see that Thailand is on the verge of a collapse, or actually has already collapsed. So this starts the chain of events in Thailand itself. But after that, you can see that the contagion effect, the ripple effect of what's happening in Thailand starts to extend to the other countries in the region as well. In July, you can see Malaysia over there. By August, Indonesia as well, and so on and so forth. As you go down the timeline, later on you will see Singapore and Philippines. I mean, they're all affected within the same timeline kind of thing. Honestly speaking, the crisis, if you want me to put a general gauge to it, it lasts for a period about 2 years on average. I think about 2 years. But different, as I mentioned before, different countries experience the crisis differently. Some countries were more locked up in recession longer than others. So, for instance, Singapore was locked up in recession for about 3 quarters, so about 3 quarters of a year. But a country like Thailand or Indonesia, they were locked up in recession for about 8 to 9 quarters, which is about 2 years plus. So we are trying to uncover and trying to find out what are the reasons for this. How come the extent of damage was greater in other countries compared to Singapore, for instance? So these are the kinds of things that we want to look at. So this is the timeline. You can read through it yourself, but it gives you the events of what's happening in 97 itself. I want you to see the speed of which things happen. Not just about what happened in Thailand, but the speed of which it escalates to the entire region, where the other economies start to frail and to falter as well. I want to start off by unpacking the term Asian financial crisis to give us a better understanding of what we're actually dealing with. Asian itself, I want to emphasize that it's region-wide. It's, again, something that's unprecedented to Southeast Asia. We've never seen an economic crisis like this in the independent era. Even though we say it's region-wide and it kind of affects everyone in the region, including like the East Asian countries like South Korea, Japan, China. But we are only going to be focusing on 5 case studies in Southeast Asia. And these 5 case studies are going to be Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Singapore. I put them in this order of kind of severity. Although Thailand and Indonesia, you may want to switch their placement depending on what I tell you later on. So that's Asian. Financial wise, even though this is classified as an Asian financial crisis, but and even though the crisis stems from the financial sector, I want you all to know that the weaknesses in the economy, it's systemic. Now, systemic means that it's throughout the entire economic structure, not just in the finance sector, but also in industry, in agriculture, in the production structures, in the way government handles the economy, in legislation, in regulation, many things to think about. It stems from the financial sector, but as the financial sector crumbles, it reveals that there is a decay in the entire economic structure or the entire way the government manages the economy. So while it's a finance crisis, but we want to extend our scope beyond the finance sector to understand what was the core issues with the economy that led to this crisis and that led to the escalation in the first place. So we have Asian, we have financial, and then now we look at crisis. The term crisis, there is a certain weight, there is a certain gravity to it. So I want to explore what gives it its weight, what gives it its gravity, why did we apply the term crisis to this event? As mentioned, it's unprecedented, so maybe that's something that we want to think about. But what do you mean by unprecedented? Unprecedented in terms of what? So the first thing that we can think about is the degree of devastation. As I mentioned just now, even though this is an economic crisis, the devastation extends all the way to the political and the social spheres. What happened in the economy actually affected politics. So there was a lot of political instability, and some governments were even toppled as a result of the economic chaos that was going on. In some countries, not only was the instability at the elite government level, but it spilled over into the streets as well, with the mass level social unrest. This is most prominently seen in Indonesia and to some extent Thailand. But yeah, you can see that the extent of damage warrants the term crisis. So that's the first thing we think about. The second thing that we can think about, as I mentioned earlier as well, is that this isn't a national level event. This is a regional level event that affected to a great degree many countries in the region. So because it is on this scale, because of this extensiveness, the magnitude of the impacts are quite big, so we can also warrant the term crisis, something that is felt by a substantial number of countries and a substantial number of the population. The third thing we can think about is the extent of the crisis. It is long, right? We said just now I say that Singapore only goes through 3 quarters worth of recession. Yeah, well, okay, sure, that's the shortest among all Southeast Asian countries, but in that 3 quarters, it is a very long 3 quarters of a year. In that period of time, there was unemployment, closure of banks, businesses, suicides, and so on and so forth. And if it's like this in Singapore, can you imagine what it's like in the other countries that have to go through two plus years worth of recession and economic turmoil? So again, I think this warrants the term crisis. Another way to look at crisis is that the degree of the problem is so large that there is no such thing as a quick fix solution. So governments, even if they conjure up some credible solution, the impact of the solution will take time to surface because the crisis is just too large and too structural and too systemic. So any solution would take time. And while the time is being taken for the solution to have its effect, the crisis still goes on, people are still suffering, nations are still suffering. So the degree of difficulty in addressing the issues is something really to consider, especially since these issues are largely structural by nature. Any solution that governments conjure up, it has to be comprehensive, and it also has to deal with the core nature of the problem, and it also needs to have sufficient capital backing. Like you need money. I mean, this is an economic crisis. You need money to solve certain things. So on top of legislation, you need money as well. So the difficulty in finding solutions and the difficulty of the solutions having an effect or an immediate effect warrants the term it's a crisis. It's difficult to resolve. The fifth thing to think about, healthy economies. At this point, healthy economies reinforcing the severity of the problem. I'm thinking about a country like Singapore. So Singapore, all along, and even up to the point of 1997, it has a healthy economy. In fact, it's doing really well. There's a robust economic structure. But even with a country like that, with a robust economic structure, it could not escape the crisis. That shows you how impactful and how extensive this crisis is and how pervasive it is that it can even destabilize the strongest of economies. And for Singapore, 3/4 in recession, I mean, that is a sufficient destabilization. That is sufficient cause for panic, I suppose. So even in the case study of Singapore, they are affected by the crisis, which shows you the extent of the crisis, how bad it is. And the last thing, the sixth thing to think about over here is international intervention. Another measure for the extent of the crisis could be about whether international actors are necessitated to come in to help Southeast Asian countries. So if international actors are coming in, like for instance the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, if they are coming in to help Southeast Asian economies, I think that shows you the extent of damage within the region itself or within the nation itself, that they require external help. So whenever there's an intervention, it does signal a massive decay or a massive disease within the economy, or massive collapse in this case within the economy. External intervention is never ever a good sign. Shows that the country or the region is in distress. So that also can qualify as a crisis. So these are 6 things to think about in terms of what qualifies as a crisis. Why I think this is important is because many of these things over here that you see, actually they serve as criteria. Using like things like the degree of devastation, the magnitude, the extent. All these things give you some weightage, gives you some help with evaluation, looking through the different case studies. So and also to help you to understand the extent of crisis with this financial situation that they have over here. So yeah, breaking down the terms, Asian financial crisis, you can think about this as you go along into the content itself. Now, just now at the start of the podcast, I did mention that, and keep in mind that our focus, as you can see in this timeline, is a causes timeline, so it's a causation timeline. When we assess the causes of the crisis, it's quite myopic and it's quite narrow of us to just focus on the events of 97 itself. So the events of 97 itself, with the investor speculation and the capital flight and all that kind of stuff, with these events happening in 97, yes, they do play a role, and they do have their unique importance. But to look at them singularly, as though they were just born out of nothing, I think that would be quite myopic in terms of argumentation, and you wouldn't really get the full picture of how it led to the events of 97 itself. So over here in this timeline, what I've tried to do is to give you the long-term issues as well as the issues in 97 itself. So taken together, I think they will give a fuller understanding of the causation concept leading to the AFC. So the long-term issues that I've put over here in this timeline, is the heading that goes structural vulnerabilities and issues. And then from then on, as you go further down the timeline towards 97, those are the issues that are more, kind of like related to what happens in 97 itself, as the momentum picks up, as like the immediate issues start to surface itself. So a lot of things, I think with regards to the structural vulnerabilities, the long-term issues, I think that there are 5 things over there, but if I try to condense the 5 things down into 2 broad categories, to keep it simple, there are things to do with the economic structures itself, and then there are things to do with the system of governance over the economy. So just to reiterate that one more time, it's to do with the economic structures itself, and then there are things to do with the issue of governance over the economic structures. All these things, don't worry too much. I'll try to unpack them one by one to give you a fuller understanding of what's happening. But for now, you can get a broad scope of things as to what the long-term issues, what the structural issues looks like. Then we go on to the short-term issues, to the more immediate issues that are happening in like around the vicinity from 94 onwards towards 97. The heading there is immediate triggers or external causes, either one you want to call it. These are a few of the the immediate causes that are happening towards the 97 outbreak itself. A lot of it comes down to investor speculation. As indicators of economic decay slowly surfaces from Southeast Asia, investors are looking into the region and they are seeing that there are certain problems or there are certain worrying signs. And the way investment works and the way investors work is that they have their own mentalities. Once investors are spooked by something, once investors are concerned over a certain development or a certain revelation, they are going to move their money out of the country. I mean, it's only a natural thing to do. If you feel that your money is not going to be, it's not going to give you a good rate of return, if you feel that the situation is worsening, if you feel that there is some bad stuff that's going to happen in the country soon, then you are going to want to pull out your money before all those things happen in order to minimize your losses. So that's exactly what it is, speculation. And it doesn't really take a lot for investors to be spooked, because it's a very, very sensitive issue. Money, it's your own money. When you any small thing, it doesn't even have to be real. It just has to be a perception. It just has to be an impression. You feel it, or you see it, you feel that sense of threat, you feel that sense of worry, immediately you're going to pull out. What happened in 1997 itself is that collectively, many investors were looking into countries in the region. First starting with Thailand, and then with Indonesia after that, and then Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore. They were looking at countries in the region and they were seeing very worrying signs in the economic structures. They were seeing very worrying signs in currency depreciation and devaluation. So all these things, right, would trigger some sort of response in them, and they started to pull out their money. And not only is it's not 1-2 people, and it's not like some some small business, some small time investor. We're talking about big investors. They all started to pull out one by one, and they all pulled out in quite quick fashion, quite concurrently as well. And so what we kind of term this as is capital flight. So there was massive capital flight from the countries in Southeast Asia, and that further worsened the situation until the point where the currencies and the economies collapsed. Some nations went into bankruptcy as well. So that is the events in 97 itself. And towards the end of the timeline, you can see some responses, especially with the IMF, and then the recovery period that goes on all the way to the end of our time frame, the year 2000. I'll not be covering that today. My focus is on the causes timeline. As you can see, my very dedicated color coding starts with yellow, so there are warning signs some decades before 97. So it's yellow, it's some warning signs. It starts to heat up a bit in the mid 1990s. So it turns to orange. And then 97 itself and beyond is the red zone where we are locked in the crisis period. So yeah, it is a very short span of time in the sense that we are only really looking at like just a few years compared to other topics. But it is very exciting, and to account for these few years, we would also need to look back into the structural issues in the economies. So I think that I hope this timeline will be useful for you to just track what's happening in terms of the long-term issues as well as the immediate issues. Now, I want to go a bit into some of these things. I will have a lecture on them, so don't worry. Now we are still at the overview, like the overarching framework kind of situation. And I just want to briefly explain some of these structural causes. So the first one we have here is the inefficient production structures. Now, briefly speaking, what does this mean is that the output. Okay, so basically Southeast Asia by this point in time, the 5 countries that we are looking at, they are more or less they are either industrializing to a good degree or they are already an industrialized economy. So there's a lot of manufacturing output. But this first point, inefficient production structures, basically says that there's a flaw in their manufacturing production, and increasingly it is not giving them the rate of return as before. So in the start, maybe like they are gaining a lot of profit, revenue, so on and so forth. But increasingly as the years go by, this revenue stream and this profit margins, they start to decrease. And why is this so? It's because there's some flaw in the manufacturing process, or is there some flaw in the planning process, or there's some complacency in the production structures that makes the products less attractive. And if it's less attractive, people don't want it, there's lower demand, so people buy it less, less revenue is coming in, and so on and so forth. The second thing to think about is financial liberalization. What this point here is about is it concerns what Southeast Asia is doing. So from the 1980s onwards, Southeast Asia is very on about liberalization. They can see the benefit of it, like the benefit of liberalization. They are growing the private sector. They are establishing international trade. A lot of links. They are exposing themselves and all that kind of stuff. But I think the problem here is that when there is too much of it, it becomes unsustainable as well, because there isn't a way to really sustain the entire process. So what this point does, the financial liberalization thing, is that it leaves Southeast Asian economies in a very vulnerable state because they are exposed to fluctuations in the external sectors. So at this point in time, again, most Southeast Asian nations, the 5 countries that we are looking at, they are already in EOI, export-oriented industrialization. So with that, they are really locked up into the economies of global trade cycles and all that kind of stuff. Potentially it's really good. There's wider markets and all that kind of stuff, but it leaves your economy vulnerable as well. So this state of vulnerability, when there's an external shock or when something disrupts the process, it can collapse pretty fast because it's on very fragile ground. So that's something that we will explore as well to see how this unfolds. The third point is something specific to the finance sector. Part of this liberalization process was the huge growth of the financial sector. There were a lot of banks that started to sprout up. They were providing capital, they were providing loans, and so on and so forth. And governments actually encourage this. Governments actually encourage banks to set up and to lend businesses to drive up production and construction and all that kind of stuff. Again, all this in theory is good. It contributes to economic growth. But once again, it got to a state of unsustainability where there was too much going around. There were too many banks going around. There was too much borrowing going around. And when investments weren't giving them a rate of return that they wanted, people and businesses and companies, they started, and even nations, they started to have problems repaying the banks. So if they don't get their revenue streams, the factories or the companies or whatever, if they don't get the rate of return that they need to repay the banks, then they are going to be kind of like in a situation where you just lock yourself in a very vulnerable state lah. So that was something that happened. A lot of banks also started to close down because they couldn't get the money back, and a lot of them sued for bankruptcy, and a lot of them were forced to close down as well. And then we have the collapse of the financial sector due to these kind of things. So governments sometimes have good intentions, but along with the good intentions, if there aren't enough safeguards, in this sense, the safeguard is legislation or supervision, then it has the potential for collapse as well. The good intention might turn out to be something very devastating for the economy. The fourth point here, over dependence on foreign borrowing, it kind of is like the third point. When governments wanted to expand their economies, they sometimes also borrowed from foreign sources. And when governments or local companies couldn't pay back these short-term loans, then they would run into the risk of defaulting on their credit, and then that leads to the similar outcomes where they are locked in a bankruptcy cycle and closures and all that kind of stuff. So we'll be looking at that as well. And then the last thing here, and this is quite pervasive to Southeast Asia, is the issue of governance and corruption, all that kind of stuff. Interestingly enough, the two countries that were hit the hardest, Thailand and Indonesia, they were countries that were associated with these issues of governance, like corruption, nepotism, and lack of transparency and political stability. So there is a strong correlation between governance and the economy. Just now I was talking to you guys about the how investors work, and investors would start to lose confidence if they see an issue in governance as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something in the economy. It can be something in politics where they look at how the government is performing, what kind of policies it has, and so on, and they will move their money based on the confidence they have in that government. So kind of like a contrast case study is Singapore, where we have a good track record of good governance, stability, political stability. So even though we suffered from the crisis, we were locked up in recession for about 3 quarters. We very quickly we could attract the foreign investment back into Singapore because of that strong track record in governance. So politics does play a part, and I want you to explore the linkages between like politics and economics as well. So those were the structural causes, and then now I want to move into the immediate causes. Okay guys, so let's just take stock of what we have so far. Remember that we are still looking at the causes of the AFC. So our main concept that we are dealing with here is still about causation. And remember, whenever we look at causation, we are looking at two things. The first thing we are looking at is at the unique importance of the various factors. Each of these factors will contribute to the crisis. So in their own way, they have their own roles, they have their own sense of importance. We are looking at their unique roles and importance. The second thing that we are looking at is the relative importance. So factors in relation to one another in causing the crisis. We are trying to evaluate and assess what's the relative importance. So despite each of them having their own unique roles, some roles may be more devastating than others. Some roles may have a greater extent of impact, and so on and so forth. So remember, whenever we look at causation, we are looking at two things. We are looking at the unique importance of factors as well as the relative importance of factors. The two big categories that we are dealing with thus far in the Asian financial crisis, we were looking at the structural causes, and there were a multitude of structural causes, all of them collectively weakening the economies, providing a huge structural vulnerability to Southeast Asian economies. And then the other category of factors that I mentioned was the immediate causes of the Asian financial crisis, which is something that I want to go into a bit now. The individual singular factors that form part of this big category called the immediate causes of the AFC. I think the first point that you see over there on investor speculation, panic selling, bank runs, capital flight outflow, all these happen in very, very quick succession and with high intensity in the period, maybe starting from April, lasting all the way to July 1997. Just a short period of 2 months, but you can see the devastating quality of investors and the effect that they will have on national economies, or in this case, even regional economies. This factor here is something that is most ostensibly seen. It is very visible, whatever is happening. You can physically see the statistics, they are going down. You can physically see investment and money and capital flowing out of Southeast Asia, flowing out of the countries. So these are very visual and very tangible signs that certain economies are not doing well and a crisis is impending. This point over here about investor speculation, it basically goes back to the idea that investors are assessing economic trends. They are assessing the economic health of the country or of the region, and they are making moves based on those assessments. As the name suggests, these are all speculative. So as long as there is an impression, as long as there is a perception that things are not going well, then they are going to pull out their money, they're going to pull out their investments. This will hurt the national economies because they are losing their vital source of capital. So what happened in Southeast Asia at that point in time is that many investors, they were looking at Thailand and they were seeing very worrying signs in the economy, some structural fragilities. They were seeing some movements in the currency. They were seeing that the Thai government was drawing from its reserves in order to defend its currency, the baht. So these are some examples of signs that investors will look at, and they would manage their capital, manage their investments based on these kind of signs. The critical point why this is so detrimental to economies is at that point in time, this happened in large volume and in very quick succession. So investors all across, they were pulling money out quite rapidly and quite extensively, which made the impact even greater. And then the second point over there, as I started out with Thailand, investors also started to see similar economic trends in some of the other Southeast Asian countries. And they did some sort of correlation because they reasoned that if Thailand evidences these kind of negative trends, Indonesia evidences these kind of negative trends, Philippines, Malaysia, so on and so forth, then it would have the same. They would predict a same negative consequence. And based on that prediction, based on that speculation, they would also start to pull out their money, not just from Thailand, but from countries within the region. So this is what we call the contagion effect. The contagion effect is primarily down to a loss of investor confidence. They do not have confidence in the economies of Southeast Asia. This loss of confidence could have stemmed from assessing economic trends, or it could have also been an assessment of the government. Remember the issue of governance over the economy. So, or it could be a combination of the two as well. Usually, it was a combination of the two, and which really plunged the confidence of investors. So the third point over here, depreciation of currency leading to increase in foreign finance debt and bankruptcy of local companies. So what this basically means is that as the currency of certain Southeast Asian nations, let's say Indonesia and Thailand, as their currency continues to depreciate, this means that whatever money that they have loaned to foreign companies, whatever money they have loaned from foreign banks or whatever, now it becomes a lot harder to repay back because their currency is losing value. It takes a lot more of their currency to repay back these foreign loans. So this situation arises when now all these nations like Thailand and Indonesia, they are unable to repay their foreign loans, and so they default on their loans, and then many of the banking companies or the local companies, they would file for bankruptcy because they are unable to repay back the loans. So it gets kind of trapped in this kind of cycle, in this circle where there is a lot of defaulting on credit loans and the inability to repay back, which forces the closure of a lot of banks, which forces the closure of a lot of companies, factories, industries, residential developers, and so on and so forth. So it really looks like the finance and the economic sectors are just collapsing, or the commercial sectors. The finance and the commercial sectors, they are all collapsing en masse. En masse means in large scale, very extensive. It's something that affects not just one sector, but the economy as a whole. Another immediate cause that you might want to think about, which comes from a more external point of view, is about the role of the IMF. And in this case, I put the government there as well, because sometimes when state actors like the government or international economic body like the IMF, they intervene, they mean well and it's supposed to help in some way, but because of flawed policy planning or because of a misdiagnosis of what the core problems are in the economy, they suggest remedies that are not aligned to address the core problems. And when that situation happens, it exacerbates the problems. It far from solving them, it actually creates maybe new problems, or it exacerbates old ones. And this was true. Governmental responses in Thailand and Indonesia initially, they weren't fully committed to solving the core problems in the economy, and that made the policies that they suggested quite insignificant, and in some cases it was even counterproductive. The IMF as well, and you would think that, the IMF being an international recognized, credible economic kind of international association, you would think that with all this credibility attached to the IMF, they could do no wrong. But actually, the IMF, in their initial diagnosis of what's happening in the crisis, they actually did misdiagnose the problem. They suggested remedies that were based on models applied to other countries elsewhere in the world. And they thought that Southeast Asia was facing the same kind of problems, so therefore they can just impose a template kind of model solution. But the problem is that Southeast Asia was facing their own unique challenges and their own unique flaws in the economy. And this template model didn't quite fit. So what happened was that the solution was not only ineffective, but actually it was counterproductive as well. It created a lot more problems for the governments in Southeast Asia to try to adhere to, which they couldn't. And even if they did, it didn't really yield any kind of like successful results. So that's something to consider for this collection of factors. The immediate causes of the AFC, these are all things that are happening within the vicinity of 97 itself, especially from the maybe April period all the way to the July-August period. The other thing that you want to consider, I talked a bit about this already, about the external causes of the AFC. You can present another dimension. So, where I give you the dominant framework of structural versus immediate causes, you can also think of internal versus external causes. So sometimes this framework, I leave it up to you. What kind of framework do you want to use for your argument? Structural versus immediate, or long-term versus short-term, or internal versus external. These are all frameworks that you can use to find the causation, AFC. But sometimes the given factor, the given factor in the question already subscribes to one of the frameworks. So if you identify the given factor as one side of the framework, then it's very easy for you to find the other side of the framework. So let's say, for instance, if the given factor in the question is something to do with internal factors cause the AFC, then immediately you know the other side or the alternative perspective is that no, it's not internal factors, but rather it was external factors. And so this is where this kind of things can come in. So what exactly are the external factors, the composite singular factors that there are in this category? You can see 3 over there. The first one is the Western liberal economic agenda before the crisis. As I mentioned in the first podcast, the 1990s, or maybe I'll put it from the late 1980s onwards, especially with the winding down of the Cold War and the imminent collapse of the USSR. The West had clearly, it was plain to see that the West had won the Cold War. And not only had the West won the Cold War, but capitalism seemed to be the triumphant economic force. It was the model to adopt for the pathway to prosperity. So it was clear to see for everyone that capitalism was the way to go. And very closely connected to capitalism is this idea of economic liberalism. So economic liberalism is that sense of openness that your country has to the rest of the world, or even within your domestic economic scene. Most prominently, how is economic liberalism practiced and manifested? You can see it in the expansion of the private sector, or you can see it in the openness towards international trade, particularly free trade. I think that's the most extreme form of economic liberalism. There is this very closely connected sense of interdependence of nations. So that's where the idea of international trade comes in, and free trade as well, where you have nations coming to join their economies together and to mutually benefit one another. Now, all this sounds very good, and in theory it is, in practice most of the time it is as well, which is why governments continually pursue economic liberalism. However, there are always two sides to the coin. One of the big vulnerabilities of economic liberalism is that it generates a sense of exposure. So economies, as they open themselves up, they are now exposed, they are going to be exposed to the fluctuations and the movements of international trade. So the interdependence that I mentioned just now is a double-edged sword. It can be good, it can be bad, depends on the world economic cycles. So Southeast Asia, especially our 5 capitalist economies, they enter the 1990s period with full-blown drive towards economic liberalism. All of them are pursuing this. Now, pursuing this in itself, again, may not have such a big an issue, but one of the big things that is learned in the drive towards economic liberalism is that there must be, in tandem with this liberalism drive, in tandem with this, there must be sufficient governmental regulation and governmental supervision. So liberalism is well and good and all that, but there needs to be some sort of state supervision that accompanies it. It's quite necessary actually, because if you leave things into the hands of the private sector entirely, or to an excessive degree, the private sector works quite differently. Their mentalities are quite different from the government. Their sole pursuance is towards profits, which may not always be a good thing for the welfare of the nation as a whole, or for the health of the economy as a whole. So governments, time after time, need to step in to manage the situation, to manage this liberalizing process, to make sure that it doesn't go into the excess. So what happened here, the first point, the external cause here is that the liberalizing agenda from the West, many Southeast Asian nations, they were influenced by it. And so they began to open up their economies, and that generated an exposure and a vulnerability. So just to give you an example of how this looks like, the vulnerability generated would be the interdependence with foreign investment. So increasingly large part of the economy is tied to the foreign sector, or even with exports, for instance. Now, when foreign investment dries up, or when foreign investment is pulled out, or when people don't want to buy your product anymore, so exports, they dwindle down, that's where your economy starts to unravel itself, because it was so built upon these sectors that when you diminish these sectors, or when these sectors are removed, then there's going to be huge problems for the economy. So the external sector, the key point here, the external liberalizing agenda, it did generate an increased vulnerability for the Southeast Asian economies. The second point over here is something that you might know, but in the 1990s, developing giants like China and India, they were also in a developmental phase. So with that, they were also moving into manufacture. They were opening up their industries, opening up the trade, going into export markets, and so on and so forth. Things that Southeast Asia was doing in the late 1970s to the early 1980s. Now China and India were doing as well. Furthermore, the markets there are a lot more attractive because there's an amazing number of people there. China and India, two of the most populous nations in the world. So there's a huge market there. Manpower is relatively cheaper there as well. And to set up companies like MNCs and all that, it's also cheaper to build your factories or to put your headquarters in China and India because of the relatively lower cost of production, given that these two are developing economies. So there's a lot of competition with Southeast Asia. Now this enhances the vulnerability that Southeast Asia has. This compounds on the external vulnerability that Southeast Asia has because the initial growth rates that we had in the past, now they are starting to taper off. Many investors and investments are also moving towards China and India. So there's a smaller piece of the pie for us, and therefore when a economic instability situation happens, we are that much more affected by it. The third point here, appreciation of the USD. Now, this one is specific to some countries. Some countries in the 1990s or maybe even in the late 80s, they made a decision. The governments of these countries, they made a decision to peg their currencies to the USD. Now, what does pegging your currencies to the USD mean? Is basically you are setting a benchmark. Your currency will be tallied to the US currency in a certain ratio. Now, if this ratio will be locked and you can't move beyond the boundaries of this ratio. So what this means is that if the USD appreciates, okay, the value of the USD increases, you have to make sure that your domestic currency increases in tandem with the USD as well, so to maintain that ratio, to not escape the boundaries of that ratio. So if the USD depreciates, it loses its value, or it goes down in value. Similarly, you would have to move your currency in tandem with the USD as well. This is my baseline level of understanding of economics. I'm pretty sure I'm right. For more like detailed how they do it and all that kind of stuff, I don't really care, and I don't think you need to explain it in your essays as well. The more important part here, right, is about what happens in the 1990s. So in the 1990s, especially I think it's around the mid-1990s, the USD starts to appreciate, which means that nations like, I think Thailand, if I'm not wrong, I think to some degree Indonesia and Philippines as well, since the USD was appreciating, these countries needed to appreciate their currencies in tandem with the USD as well. Now, the main thing that you need to know is this. Now, when a country's currency appreciates, it's much more expensive for you to buy their goods. So that means to say that the main point is that the exports, okay, exports of, let's say for instance Thailand, Thai exports are now more expensive. So Thai exports are now more expensive, therefore it is less attractive. Now, if the Thai exports are less attractive, the demand will be lower, and the trickle-down effect is that people will want less of Thai exports. They will look for cheaper alternatives, let's say China and India. And therefore, Thailand's national income will decrease because their export revenues would decrease as well. So this is about the production structures, they are tapering off as well. National income is not enjoying the high rates that it did enjoy in the 80s and in the early 90s. They are starting to taper off as well. So all these things kind of come into together. Remember, unique importance and relative importance. All these things kind of come together where the health of the economy, the structures of the economy are now starting to unravel themselves. At the same time, when the immediate and external causes in the 1990s are also starting to have their effect. So all these things kind of like start to come together, and then you have July 1997 when it finally reaches the critical point and it spills over in Thailand. Now, going into arguments and how do we make sense of all these various factors to consider? How do you construct a good argument? So the framework that I've been going along with thus far is structural versus immediate. So that's the framework that I choose to adopt. Again, there are many other frameworks and you can choose to adopt the rest. Now for structure and immediate, I think this is the main thing, but how do I really make use of them? Now for the structural factors, because they are long-standing in nature, because they are pervasive, they are extensive in that the structure, it affects most sectors of the economy. It comes down to the very foundations of the economy. I feel that the structural factors, they are responsible for the magnitude and the severity of the crisis. In that sense, why the crisis became a crisis is not so much because of the immediate factors, but it's because of the decay and the disease within the economic structures that have been going on for decades, even leading up to the point of 1997. So you can see there weak foundations of Southeast Asian economies that resulted in structural vulnerabilities, and the triggers in the external environment, they work upon these structural vulnerabilities. They manifest them. The second bullet point over there, another point to emphasize how important the structural factors was: inability to address limitations and problems in the economy in the lead up and during the crisis period. So many of the crisis continued because these structural problems could not be addressed, or they were so large that it took time for them to be addressed, which gives further credence, it gives further reinforcement to the argument that these structural factors were really the cause of the AFC, such that in the inability to address them or in the difficulty of addressing them, the crisis continued. So that shows you that the core of the problem still persisted, still maintained, and only when the core of the problem was somewhat addressed, then did the positive trends or the negative trends, only then did the negative trends start to subside and then moved closer and closer towards positive trends. So that kind of gives you an emphasis on the structural factors. Now the immediate factors, are they important? Yes, they are. Do they have their own unique roles? Yes, they have as well. So for me, the unique role of the immediate factors is that they're responsible for the timing of the crisis, the exacerbation, the escalation, the catalyst, compounding, all these kind of like secondary, subsidiary terms that you want to use. It does subscribe and it does ascribe to them a level of importance. But this importance with these terms, it seems secondary in nature, where the core issues still lie with the structural issues. So establish the complex relationship between the immediate factors and the structural factors, in that the structural factors are still the foundational, they are still the ones that are extensive and severe and so on, whereas the immediate ones are the trigger points, or that they exacerbated trends that were already present, and things like that. In terms of the countries, as I mentioned, we are looking at primarily 5 case studies, and they are on. I have placed them on a severity scale. So starting with the one that was, I suppose, hit the most, and where it all started, it was Thailand. I put Indonesia second, but as I mentioned earlier, you might consider changing around Indonesia and Thailand because, in terms of the devastation, in terms of the economic, social, and political devastation, I would say that actually Indonesia is the one that should be at the end of the spectrum because Indonesia experienced all three devastations and they experienced it for quite a prolonged like time lah. So I think you might want to consider those two. But whatever it is, I think those two will be in the red zone. The ones that are in the middle are Philippines and Malaysia. They do suffer not as much as Indonesia and Thailand, but also more than Singapore. So I kind of put them in the middle. They do suffer from some things. They're roughly in about 5 to 6 quarters of recession. So I put them somewhere in the middle. And Singapore, 3 quarters in recession, bounce back quite fast. So I think I'll put it all the way to the other end of the spectrum. Now, you might be wondering if there is a need to talk about the other case studies in Southeast Asia, the other 5, like the 3 Indochina case studies, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and then also to talk about another country like, what am I missing? Myanmar, Burma. Yeah, I don't think that in AFC questions you would really need to talk about them. To be honest, I don't think that they were as affected by the AFC as these 5 countries here. And for a very simple reason, is because these 5 countries are long-standing liberal and capitalist economies. So even though how much we say that they are hybrid economies and there's some socialist elements here and there, but these 5 case studies represent the 5 foremost capitalist economies in Southeast Asia. So with an external vulnerability like foreign investment, they would be affected by it the most. With an external vulnerability like financial markets and stocks, and commercial development, things like that, these 5 countries will be affected the most. I think there's no issue with you just using 5 case studies for this essay. It already exceeds the minimum 3 that Cambridge requires, but I think we should aim for these 5 because it gives you a variety of case studies to consider, some at the end of the spectrum compared to others at the other end of the spectrum, and things like that. Yeah, so I think I hope that I've given you a framework and overview of what the factors that cause the AFC look like. With regards to each of the factors themselves, I will go into greater detail to explain how things work. But I just want you to keep in mind that, and especially for this topic of the AFC, I want you to keep in mind that you are not meant to write an economics essay. The AFC, the econs knowledge here is a lot more technical compared to the economic development topic. So the trap here is that we go too much into economic explanations. Remember that we are still writing a history essay. Even though the AFC topic is a lot more technical, you need to understand certain economic terms and how certain economic workings play out. We should not create economic essays. We stick to what we know about historical argumentation. Okay, so I hope you enjoy this podcast. Hope it helps. Please watch this or listen to this before Wednesday's lecture. Okay, thanks guys. Peace out.